Okay, so why don't we get started then? And I'll start by thanking everyone for logging on to this webinar. I'm Chris Myers, and I have the pleasure of hosting this session. Today, we'll be talking to the authors of Learning That Matters, a field guide to course design for transformative education. The book published in December of 2020, and in the last few months, it has already started making waves in the field. From the pre-registrations, we have a very good turnout for this session, so I'm hoping that that is going to translate into a lively conversation about the book as well. As I mentioned, as you watch this presentation, if you have questions, if you'd like to make comments, please use either the Q&A button or the chat button at the bottom of your screen. I'll pass along anything relevant to the authors, and we'll see about keeping the conversation moving through a lot of good questions. So first, let me give you a brief description of the book. Our society urgently needs education that motivates, challenges, engages, and affirms all students. No matter their previous successes or failures, every student has enormous learning potential and important contributions to make now and in the future. Such meaningful learning experiences don't just happen, they need to be intentionally designed. This book supports those who will undertake this vitally important work. Learning That Matters, a field guide to course design for transformative education, is a pragmatic resource for designing courses that engage college students as active citizens. This workbook, and work is put in quotes there because it's sort of a hybrid, provides research-informed approaches for creating learning experiences and developing innovative, intellectually engaging courses. Whether a novice or a veteran, by engaging with the text, collaborating with colleagues, and reflecting on the important work of a teacher, any motivated educator can become a transformative educator. Every college course has the potential to transform students' lives. Through implementation of critical concepts such as connected and authentic assessments, dilemmas, issues, and questions, portable thinking skills and engaging strategies, and a purposeful focus on inclusivity and equity, readers begin the process of change needed for preparing students who will be able to address the monumental challenges facing our society. So that's a bit about the book. And now let me tell you a bit about the four authors of the book, all of whom have graciously joined us today: Carolyn Zender, Cynthia Alby, Karen Klein, and Julia Metzger. So a couple of brief bios. Carolyn Zender. Carolyn's journey as a transformative educator started at Georgia College, while Carolyn has spent much time at large research-focused institutions as both learner and faculty, earning her BS in biology from Penn State, PhD in ecology from UGA, and in her current role as a lecturer in biology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she has always been passionate about teaching and relationship building. Carolyn explores gardens, hikes, and birds with her husband and 8-year-old daughter in Western Massachusetts. Cynthia Alby has spent most of her career immersed in what could most accurately be described as avid cross-discipline idea synthesizing. She studies pedagogy, sociology, psychology, neuroscience, and economics, anything that might yield useful clues to improving the art and craft of teaching. Her primary research question is, how might we re-enchant learning to increase faculty and student joy? She joined Georgia College in 2001, where she is a professor of teacher education, and she has also served as director of the LEAP initiative and co-director of the Center for Teaching and Learning there. In addition, for nearly 20 years, she has helped to develop faculty from across the state in Georgia's Governor's Teaching Fellowship Program. Cynthia and her husband, Charlie, wait for it, live on a farm called Shangri-La, where they raise a critically endangered breed of sheep and livestock livestock guardian dogs. Let's see, lost a page. Hang on. Karen Klein. Karen is a strong advocate for taking a circuitous pathway to learning, having landed in the learning profession of teacher preparation at Georgia College after employment in an assortment of disparate positions, from postal delivery in Southern California to hotel management in the Mid-Atlantic region, then on to middle school education in Maine. She encourages all learners, especially those who are preparing to become educators, to feed their sense of intellectual ambition, which is why she immensely appreciates collaboration with these exceptional women co-authors. It is Karen's great fortune to be living and working in the splendid Appalachian Mountains with her beloved family of learner teachers. And finally, Julia Metzger. Julia received her first degree from the Evergreen State College, where she learned firsthand the value of a transformative liberal arts education. She went on to a PhD in inorganic chemistry, after which she taught at Georgia College, stirring up some good trouble with her co-authors. During this journey, she found a passion for developing other educators and turned to a career in faculty professional development. After 13 years living and working in the South, she returned home to the Pacific Northwest for her dream job as director at the Washington Center for Improving Undergraduate Education. She and her partner Joe raised chickens and bees with the help of an unruly Australian shepherd. So those are the very talented authors who made a great team in creating this book. So without me talking anymore, let's get them doing some talking. And to the team, here's the question. I've provided a brief description of the book, but perhaps the four of you could expound upon it. Why this book now? So, whoop, sorry.
That's me, sorry.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a webinar, right, if we didn't first try and find our mute button. So I want to start by saying I'm so excited to be here with all of you, and also I love seeing all the folks in the chat. Like, so many of them are from so many different parts of my career and path, and I'm just sending lots and lots of love to all of you, because this book wouldn't exist without many of you. And so what I wanted to start by saying why this book now is really lean in on the culturally affirming approach that we take. And I think that it might be a little bit different than what folks are imagining when I say that. The approach that we've taken is really centering the user, or designing for the user, in the context that the user are the learners in our classrooms. And so we really dig in on helping the readers and ourselves try and understand how students' experience in their course kind of are impacted by their past experiences in the educational system, and how we can center that and understand that to help them in the learning experience in the classroom. And so I think a critical piece of that is just centering the humanity of the students in our classroom, trying not to treat them as a wide swath of people, but understanding that they are individuals with dreams and hopes, and understanding that our courses are impacting those dreams and hopes. And one thing that comes to mind for me is that there's a podcast that I've been loving recently from the Columbia Center for Teaching and Learning called Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning. And the reason I'm intrigued by this is because there are so many practices that we adopt just because when we start to teach, they're in the water, everybody else does them, and we don't really interrogate them. And this podcast is kind of digging through these dead ideas, things that we're carrying, but they aren't really supported by evidence. Something like grading on a 100-point scale. Why do we do that? What's the rationale behind that? So throughout the book, you'll kind of see these strategies that sort of center the humanity of students in a way that is culturally affirming.
Yes, I've noticed that when people have talked to me about the book, the culturally affirming aspect of it has been something that has just risen to the top in terms of what they found interesting. Why I would say this book now is that it is simultaneously practical and inspirational. It's practical because we requested that it be made to a size where there would be space for writing. In the book, there's lots of prompts, all kinds of activities. And I think we're also really making it practical by developing a accompanying website so that there's just lots of things that you can open up and download and use just right there at your fingertips. But I think the inspirational part is particularly important right now because we just kind of all need a boost. And I would say that that what allows that to happen in this book is that we're very focused around meaning and purpose. And when you focus on meaning and purpose, that's where inspiration often arises. And really where this came from, this book grew out of a grassroots effort called the Innovative Course Building Group. And what we discovered through that is that a grassroots group of people can start a revolution. You just need some people in a book. Get the book, get some people. You can make a big difference with it.
Yes, so that's definitely inspirational, Cynthia. So when I think about why this book now, I think about, as Julie was talking about, the humanity of people, centering on that, which I think is important. But I also think it's important to center on the humanity of the collective. And so one of the things that I think this book does now is focus on community building. I think you can feel it here today. I too want to thank all of the people that came today, that I've had some connection with in the past, that have contributed to my learning in the past and my being able to do this here. And so I think you'll pick that. I think you'll pick that up in today's webinar. So one of the things that we've intentionally built into the book is ways for you to collaborate with others. We certainly recommend that you work through the book with another colleague, but even if you're alone, you have us for support. There are prompts, thought-provoking prompts throughout the book. It's ideal for book clubs. So we really see this as a way, like, let's bring people together. We also use a lot of social media, and the point there is to try to find your people as you're working through this using the social media. You might come upon others that feel similarly to you in terms of those hopes and dreams. And one thing that we want to encourage you to do is look for the hashtag learning that matters. That's a way that we can support you, you can support us, and we can bring this kind of collective to having more impact than any single one of us might have on our own.
Yes, again, I just want to, like, as everybody said so far, thank you all for coming. This is so exciting, and just to kind of see multiple people that have, we've all worked with and had wonderful collaborations with, and hopefully people out there that we can in the future work with and collaborate with, because that is obviously something that we are really big on. So finally, thinking about why this book now and what's special about it, we have, I can't imagine anybody teaching in higher ed or even teaching in other contexts who can't find something in our book that like just connects with them in terms of their discipline, where they are on their journey, or even the types of classes they teach. So there are strategies that will work if you're teaching a first-year seminar with a dozen students, to strategies that I was using in my 300-person biology class that I taught just a couple hours ago. And there are things specific to those, and then other ideas that we believe and show how you can scale them across multiple types of learning environments. And also there's examples from multiple different disciplines. And so we really tried hard to bring in ideas and context so it can be relatable, and you'll find like your discipline and your ideas there. And while we, wrote this with the idea of like it's mostly based on face-to-face teaching, obviously we've all had a nice crash course in online learning over the past year for those of us who weren't Zoom experts before this all began. And I'm even going back to the book now and think there's things where, with just a little tweak or just getting really good with Zoom breakout rooms, being able to apply the ideas in an online and face-to-face. And finally, I think this book appeals to any of us along the range, like wherever we are in our journey as educators, faculty developers, administrators. You're going to find things here where, I wish this is the book I'd wish I'd had when I first started teaching. But it's now a book I go to both for inspiration, but also because it pushes me to sit back and reflect, and importantly, think about my students and be intentional. So just like I use some of the prompts and reflective exercises, and I find I need them now in my teaching more than ever, because things have gotten to be just so sometimes overwhelming and crazy. And so this book really helps me do that. So something we've mentioned throughout is that we tried to make it, as Cynthia said, practical and inspirational. And I think on the practical side, one of the things about it is that it's chock full of strategies. So to Cynthia and Julia, what is your favorite strategy that we have in our book?
So I would say that probably it's the discussion strategies that I think is that section is particularly wonderful. It looks at some broad concepts, such as how do you create a community agreement so that you have a better quality of discussion. And of course, a perennial favorite, how do you handle heated moments? So we've got a section on that. And we look at this idea that students are a lot better at discussing if they've done some kind of warm-up activity that prepares them for it, so they aren't just going in cold. And so I like the pre-discussion activities that we offer, and also the during discussion activities, where we look at how providing a structure or a protocol around a discussion can often really make a big difference, as opposed to just a free-for-all. You know what happens then. There's some students who don't talk at all, a few others dominate. And so we've looked at a lot of ways to kind of get around that. Three that I'll just quickly mention. I love a strategy called Circle of Voices, which Julia taught me. At first it sounded too simple to be interesting. Like she's just like, yeah, you just provide an order for the students to go in. Like if it's face-to-face, maybe they're in a circle, and they speak in order. And I'm telling you, it made a huge difference in my class, because we were hearing from everyone. People weren't just jumping in on top of each other. There was something about it that was very beautiful and fulfilling. And it was just so simple. One of my very favorites, co-construction circles, this idea that you give students a task to do at home. They're going to be talking in small groups, and so each person does a task at home, a different task. So when they come together, they each bring something to the table that's meaningful. I love that one. And finally, task assignment is a great one, because we know a great conversation requires people to encourage and compliment and make connections and summarize. So if you assign people those tasks at first and let them practice just one piece of good conversation making, soon they get good at all those different things, which is fabulous. How about you, Julia?
I'm going to cheat and I'm going to bring in 2 into the room, and really following on this idea of culturally affirming. These are 2 strategies that I've used a lot actually in my work with faculty and also with students, and I think they work just generally well with people. The first one is an empathy map, and it's something that we've borrowed from the design thinking world. So this is where designers sort of think about who's going to be using their product and really dig into who that person is. So imagine a toy designer is sitting down with 3-year-olds and a prototype of their toy to figure out how the 3-year-olds are going to use the toy, and then use what they observe to improve on that. We do the same thing but with learners. And so the idea is that you build student profiles. Ideally, you'd have access to the students who are going to be in your class prior, and you could kind of understand who they are, but often we don't have that experience. So we offer you a strategy in the book for building composite profiles using demographic data from your institution or from your student affairs colleagues, and using that to then think about how the choices that you're making when you choose a particular assignment or a grading strategy, how that might be experienced by those composite profiles to help you make decisions that are very student-centered. So it's fun. It really helps you understand who your students are. It's also really great to do if you have a partner who's working at your institution, so you can kind of talk through the different ways in which you've experienced these demographics of students in your class. And then, so that's one of my really favorite ones. I do want to send out kind of and this, we do say this in the book, that it's always challenging to put on someone else's identity. So just acknowledging that you are not adopting someone else's identity. You're just trying to use identity markers to be more familiar with how they experience the educational system that you're setting up for them. So that's one. And then another one that I've been using quite a bit is using Okун's work on the characteristics of white supremacy from dismantlingRacism.org, which I'll put that in the chat in a minute. In their work, they provide a list of characteristics that show up in our organizations and classrooms as markers of white supremacist structures. And when I started to read this list, I was just overwhelmed by how much of this I've adopted in my own classroom without even really thinking about it. So for example, one of the big ones is a sense of urgency drives all decision making. And I'm sure that if any of you work in higher ed, a sense of urgency is driving much of your decision making on a regular basis. But just using these characteristics as a lens to look at the strategies or practices or choices that you're making in your class can be really helpful for you to think how you might make changes. For example, for me, I always had this sense that we had to get through a certain amount of content. I teach chemistry, right? And so like, I got to get through those chapters. And just that sinking feeling of knowing that you're moving to the next chapter when like half your class is not ready to move, but you're like, urgency, right? And if you unpack that and think like, well, what's the value that I'm sending to my learners right now? And I don't want to be sending that getting to the next thing is more important than your understanding. And so that's just an example of how I've used that. So I'm going to ask my fellow authors a question, and that is, what do you think makes your perspective on, or the perspective in the book on course design unique? And I'm going to hand this over to Carolyn and then Karen.
Thanks, Julia. So I think one unique perspective that we focus on in the book is the dilemmas, issues, and question approach, the DIQ approach, which is in chapter 5 is entirely devoted to it. And then we take that and bring it in and weave it throughout the rest of the chapters as we build on that, as we would imagine you reading through this, building it into your course. And so this approach is an idea of using dilemmas, problems, current events, issues, problems, current events, like things that are happening in the news, ideas your students are excited and concerned about, or questions, big questions facing society, or the top questions in your field, building those or letting those dilemmas, issues, or questions, DIQs, provide the framework or the context for the concepts and material and skills and dispositions that you're hoping students develop in your class, or helping students to develop in your class. And so the great thing about DIQs is that they provide motivation, kind of the why, why should I learn about, like in my case last week, it was why should I learn, why should students learn about phylogenies and like reading evolutionary trees? And COVID variants provided a very, something that wasn't in my course last year. Like here, why we're interested in this, we're looking at mutations, we're looking at evolutionary change. We want to read these trees and understand what it means for public health. And so it provides a why and a hook. And we know that providing that type of framework is motivating for all students, but it's especially motivating for students who have been disenfranchised and underserved by higher ed for forever. And so, if we're thinking about women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics and STEM disciplines, or first generation college students or students of color, there's many times when having the why and the purpose provides an extra boost, provides extra motivation, and can really help with then performance and learning. And so it really, I think, if we're really going to center our students and decenter ourselves, it's important to think about, okay, well, why do my students need to know this information, and what's going to make it interesting and relevant and help them connect their lived experiences to what we're learning in class. And finally, the final reason I really like the DIQ approach, and it touches on the what has been said so far in terms of inspiration and hope. It can be, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say for any of the attendees here, sometimes you listen to the news these days and feel a little bit down, depressed, overwhelmed. And I teach because I believe in the power of education, because I believe in the power of learning. And teaching this way gives me hope that I'm helping to develop the learners who can hopefully help solve some of the big problems facing our societies, because they're getting some bit of training, working with others, solving complex problems. And if we want college, if we want higher ed to fulfill that promise, then we need our courses to align with that promise.
Absolutely. I'm going to interrupt for one moment just to let all of our attendees know that we're encouraging them to ask questions and pass on comments. You can use either the chat button or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to pass on any questions, and we'll see about getting them answered. Also, there is a link listed in the chat frame giving access to the book on our website in case you wanted to get more information about it. So, go on.
Okay. So the question is, what makes our perspective on course design unique in this book? And gosh, there's just so much about it that I think makes this unique. And one of the things I think about is really introducing the readers to the principles, the design principles, and the research and the theory that undergird those. I mean, I don't see a lot of books that come out of something other than the author's opinions. And so I think that's one thing that makes this a strength. The other thing that I would say is that makes us unique is, similarly, I talked about this before, but it's the emphasis on the learning community development. Many of us come to teaching in higher ed or even K-12, where we learn a lot about how to interact with individual learners, but we don't learn much about how to scaffold that community. And it's actually that community building that allows those individuals to flourish, to thrive. And so you really need skills in the learning community development. Some of the people that are here today, I've really learned a lot about that from them, both the co-authors and others that are participating. And that didn't dawn on me till later in life, even though I had been a middle grades teacher for a while, that wow, I'm just paying attention to individuals. I'm not paying attention to the whole. And how do I do that? How do I have that withedness? How do I have that personal interaction, that focus on what would help this person, and then this person contributes to the group. And so I think a thing that's really unique about the book, again, is this perspective on building for us all, not just building for a few. And Carolyn, all the time you were talking about the DIQs, I kept thinking, well, it's unique because what a snappy acronym, DIQ. And so I guess that's another thing I would just say is we're having fun, and we want you to have fun as you're doing this course design. So that's my ideas. So I then want to kind of turn this all over to everyone else. And Chris has told you, put your questions in the chat or the Q&A function, but we really want to hear from you. We do not believe that you just want to hear from us. And so what questions do you have for us?
You know, and I'm also going to jump in. You've talked about the book, but you haven't talked about the cover. And I remember when we were working on the design of the front cover, you had a particular look you were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, we definitely, a lot of us have a science background, and the idea of you do things in the field. I'm in teacher preparation, and where you do a lot of the learning is in the field. So that was really important to us to have a field guide. I know Cynthia talked about, pages that you could write in, but even more than that, and maybe Cynthia, you want to talk about that, or somebody else wants to talk about, like, what's special about a field guide?
Yeah, and I'll say that we modeled the cover after the most famous field guides. If you, and Carolyn can jump in and remind me, I'm drawing a blank on what those are called.
The Audubon ones.
The Audubon guides, right.
Yeah, so if you have an Audubon field guide at home for anything, birds, insects, whatever, you'll notice they all have a certain sort of look to them. And so we tried to kind of design this to have a similar look. And
so you're going to be doing a series of these books then?
Yeah, we might have to. Birds and course design.
There you go, yeah.
Course design, yes. And I think, to me, the whole field guide aspect of it also speaks to a practicality. And, like you use a field guide, well, at least I do, to identify, like, I see a bird, I don't know what it is, I use the field guide to help me figure it out. And I think that's what we've got here, is this concept of when it comes to teaching, when it comes to course design, you've got a question about something, what do I do? And literally you could take the book and use it to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Very good. All right, we have a question from Monica Martins. She says, I am really interested in the connection between teacher and student resiliency and improving approaches to teaching, especially in relation to helping both to feel like they are authors of their professional and academic lives. How would you respond to that?
Can I jump in? I really appreciate that, Monica, because I was about to lean in on a part of the book that we haven't talked too much, and that is about our own identity development as teachers. This also thread as educators is threaded throughout, and a lot of that is, I think it's about understanding how you're developing as you develop as an educator and grow and learn from your practice, but also remaining to keep the joy in the practice central, and that's that sounds easier than it actually is, right? So sometimes it's really very hard because you've got so many things going on, you're pulled in so many directions. And what we do throughout is we have these reflection moments in the book, which are like a little piece of giving yourself a little bit of time to reflect on your practice and grow and think about something. And that's often not the kind of time that we afford ourselves. And I think to respond to the question from Monica, I believe it's these small moments that help you think about your practice, find joy in what you're doing, that help you build that resiliency, and then turning around and doing that for your students.
Okay.
And I would just also add, I'm not sure that this is the connection. I'm explaining the connection, but I will say that I find this to be a useful strategy, and that is to really identify in every student what he or she contributes to the group and be able to highlight that. Now, I know some of you are teaching like 400-person classes. Then I might think about people in small groups, but what is a small group contributing? And maybe they're particularly joyful, maybe they're particularly enthusiastic, maybe they're particularly critical, maybe they bring like an eye to like, oh, we're going to find the problems before we, put forth any solutions, whatever it is. And I think just like highlighting that, elevating that you bring something particular here. In my experience, that has helped develop resiliency for the learners, but it's also helped me persevere because I can see that I am making a difference when I do that.
Right. Excellent. When I was working with the four of you on the book, one of the things that struck me is how diverse your backgrounds are in terms of academics. You're coming from a lot of different disciplines and a lot of different approaches. There's a question here from Tate Hurwitz that applies to everybody, and it's a great question. I feel lucky to teach in a discipline where small classes are the norm, and the ability to know my diverse group of students individually is relatively easy. But I know that many of my colleagues in other departments struggle with knowing their students in very large classes. In light of this, I am intrigued by the balance between the individual and the whole that you've mentioned. Maybe you could speak about that balance in the context of teaching large lecture classes.
Maybe I'll jump in there, just fresh off one of my large lecture classes. And so thank you, Tate, for that question. And I do want to acknowledge, like, that is a tension, that is a reality of, I have 300 students on a webinar that I don't know all, I don't have the brain power to know all of, or the time, hours in the day to know all of them personally. And so there, I think our strategies and how we approach the class and thinking about the design there is building in as many sort of ways as possible for supporting students and thinking about them in multiple different facets and multiple, there are multiple different perspectives and identities. And I think one of the design approaches we mentioned in chapter 3, universal design for learning, something many of you may be familiar with, the idea for building your course from the get-go to support as many learners as possible, so that then you're not having to go back in later on for making changes or adding things on later for one specific instance. And so it does mean a lot of time, in the beginning in the design process, but I think that's something we're all putting in no matter the class size. And then it's building in multiple ways for getting feedback from students, and multiple ways, I think, for being approachable and accessible, because you're not gonna I'm not able to say, hey, I'd like to meet one-on-one with everybody within the first 2 weeks, but I think we can, there's definitely ways for showing the small things like, okay, I'm always like here a little bit earlier, hanging around a little bit later on Zoom to answer questions, to the, multiple ways where students can submit questions and get responses. And more, and then it becomes, I think, even more important in the large lecture classes, help, especially this past year where they're not sitting in class together, helping them connect with each other so that they have that peer support, because it's not just me, it's not just about their connection to me, it's about their connection, feeling like they belong and are one in the community of learners in the classroom. But I do, I think that's a great question and something that a lot of us think a lot about and ponder.
Very good. Yeah. Linda Townsend brings up an interesting point. She says, we are finding faculty struggling with the various levels of background knowledge, especially with freshman course levels, and how to get everyone up to speed and more on a more equal learning plane. And I'm sure you've all encountered that in your teaching, right?
If I'm not hogging it, I want to say one of the things that you find in our book, we call this an it's the opposite of, the asset orientation is the opposite of deficit thinking. So most of us, many of us come into the classroom thinking, this student doesn't know this, this student can't do this, this student, like we take a survey of all the things they cannot do. And so like, oh, some students don't know the, I'll just say Krebs cycle, and they're supposed to. Instead, what we ask you to kind of do is reorient, and we help you do this, I think, to what does this student know? What does this student bring? So that it's actually a reframing that I think calls into question, like, why do we think these levels are uneven? They're not uneven, they're just different. And so if you take that sort of perspective, you are able to start maybe trusting students, say in groups, for them to start sharing their experiences with one another. And then suddenly that group is all amplified. So that's one of the things that's in the book, definitely, that I think you don't necessarily see in everyday professional development.
Right.
I would add that the strategies that we recommend in the book tend towards strategies that allow students to support one another, and that allow students to bring in their lived experience and feel like whatever their lived experience is valuable to bring to the table. And so that was kind of the lens we were looking through as we were trying to determine, what strategies do we want to promote here?
Good. We have a question that's been answered through the Q&A link, but I think it's important to mention it anyways, from Brenda Gonzalez. And she says, I'm a graduate student. My dissertation is in process. It explores the need for a robust and structured professional development program that addresses the needs of faculty members and directors of academic programs at the private higher education university. How would your book help me to create an effective PhD program, professional development program? I'm sorry.
I know I just talked, I'm jumping in here.
Go.
One of the things that I've been working in faculty development for 20 years now, and one of the things I've come to discover is that people tend to think that what faculty want are quick little one-off, like lunch and learn kinds of things, and those have their place. But we've discovered at Georgia College and through the state's Governor's Teaching Fellows Program that what faculty are really hungry for is long-term development with a group of people who they get to know and who support them. something that allows them to go deep. And that's very much what this book was designed for, is to take individuals from the very beginning of designing a course, through to having like a real kind of skeleton in place, because that's what we found faculty are clamoring for.
Good point. We have a question from Brenda Rolfe Maloney. I miss the in-person interactions, and I often find it more difficult to get to know students online. Do you have any ideas on how to better connect? So you're really getting grilled today.
I know. I want to say hi, Brenda. It's so great that you're here. Brenda was, we used to do these institutes, and maybe hopefully we'll do them again. The course design institutes, which this book kind of was born out of, and Brenda was in one of our very first institutes. And I will say, I just first want to acknowledge that all of these questions are actually difficult challenges that we encounter, and I don't want to dismiss the challenges that are there. And the one about in-person and building community online is a tough one. It's a really tough one, particularly if you throw in like inequities and accessibility to like Wi-Fi, Zoom, like the ability to access the space. I will say that one of the things that we've been finding on our campus is really useful is making sure that your synchronous time together is low stakes. So that you're removing kind of the anxiety of having to perform, and is about community building. And so one of the things that I've been doing a lot lately is just asking these odd questions for folks to kind of just think through. Like, I wish I could spend more time on X, or, one of the things that's bringing me joy right now is blank. And then having these ways to get people to start talking about things that aren't necessarily related to the content. And that is another thing that you'll see woven through our book, that we very much take a stance that learning is a social endeavor. And so you've got to build relationships in order to really get into that deep learning. And building the relationships, it's very hard to build relationships by, I'll use Karen's example, discussing the Krebs cycle, right? So sometimes it's like spending some time on having students talk about who they are, what excites them before transitioning into content will help to build those relationships and those interdependencies. So that's a strategy that I've been finding useful in the Zoom. And I will say, I cannot wait to be back in a room with people again, because I realize how much I took for granted.
All right, since I'm the bad guy who has to moderate this thing, we're looking at the clock. We're 50 minutes into a 1-hour session. The chat section is now lighting up with questions. So obviously you've stimulated some broad thinking here. We'll get through as many of these as we can. And before we sign off, it would be good if we could give our attendees some link so that they could communicate with you after the session is over and continue the conversation, and maybe even be able to do another one of these. Here is a question. Does your book offer suggestions on how to incorporate experiential / community-based learning into courses? And does it offer examples of it?
I'll jump in here.
Okay.
Yes, this is the kind of one of the key concepts that this book grew out of was this DIQ concept, the idea that a course needs to be grounded in something larger often than the subject itself, something that allows students to connect what's happening inside the classroom to what's happening outside the classroom. And so we've all, for a number of years, really worked with this idea of having some kind of dilemma or issue or question that forms the foundation for the course. And oftentimes, that's where service learning types of things can come into play, and other types of transformative experiences. That idea of helping students connect what's happening in the classroom with what's happening outside the classroom. We're big proponents of that, and that the chapter that looks at dilemmas, issues, and questions takes a deep dive into that concept.
And I want to also add that a lot of this is grounded in social learning theory, and according to that, really, and one of my heroes, John Dewey, all learning is experiential learning. Unless you have an experience that you process, you don't learn anything. And so I would say really everything that we're advocating for here can be seen as an experience. And then sometimes the focus might be on, well, how are you becoming equipped to make contributions to your community? Where do you still need to do that? So I would just say that all of it indirectly is about experiential learning.
Good. Here's an easy one for you. It's from Linda Nilsson. I have built my transformative courses around quote unquote big ideas, such as what explains the things that happen to people and how much free will do we have? What advice does your book offer to this kind of course?
Well, Linda, those sound like amazing courses, and I don't like I think what Cynthia was just mentioning, and I actually have the chapter list here. So chapter 5, the dilemmas, issues, and questions. So like that, your courses that you're talking about there, I think are some of the, like a penultimate example of example of like what type of course we're looking at, where there's these big these are questions that philosophers have been pondering for forever, and why not have our students wrestle with those now? And something we really, I think, in the book, and something as a group we've talked a lot about is, I think a lot of us, you might know programs or departments where like special courses like that, they're reserved for the honors program, or they're in that senior capstone course that actually only a handful of students are able to get into. And we strongly believe that contributes to, that idea contributes to some of the inequities that we see within the education system. And so the more we can have these types of really thoughtful, engaging, deep learning experiences designed around big questions like those, then those need to be for everyone. And also that then democratizes the idea about what thinking and learning is. It's not something that's just done by these elite, eggheads in an ivory tower. It's something that all of us do, and it's that connects all of us.
I'm going to just jump in and say, I think that seeing the table of contents reminded me of two things that I think respond to Linda's question, and that is the portable outcomes and the connected assessments chapters are really taking these ideas of learning outcomes and student assessments to another level. And in particularly, the connected assessment is really weaving these ideas that we've been talking about centering the student, thinking about the student's goals, and connecting that to the ways in which you assess and evaluate them. And I think that that, if I was to say, great, I teach around, big questions and themes. And then the next thing I would say is, how are you evaluating students? And does that align with the themes that you've got in your course? Because often we send these cognitive dissonance messages to our students. We're studying something about freedom, and then we are providing an evaluation structure that is so deeply restrictive that they can't really square the two. And so I think that's where I would say the next step is really thinking about those evaluation schemes that we use and what messages they send.
Right. This might be sort of a finishing up question, if you will. And although you've covered the material before, I think it's a good way of summarizing some core themes of the book. This is from Brajendra Panwar, and she is writing from India. And she says, I am a professor teaching journalism and mass communication in India. How can this book add value to my teaching? And I think that's a great summary question to ask, because it gives you a chance to really encapsulate your ideas.
Well, I think kind of what it does big picture is take you on a journey from the initial seeds of redesigning a course or designing a new course, through really thinking through each step, both philosophically and practically, so that bit by bit you're building, and all the way through that, having a real eye to equity. So that's what I think it does. It helps you create a course that is coherent, makes sense to students, feels powerful to students, and is culturally affirming.
Great. Julia?
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that, because I think that sparked for me something that I think is really important. What this book will help you do is it will help you align the choices you make when you're designing your learning experiences with the value system that you hold. And this, for many years in my teaching career, I found those two things were not connected. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. Like, why is what I'm doing in the classroom not connected to the value system that I hold? And I think for me, this book is sort of the culmination of figuring out how to do that.
Excellent. Okay. Does anybody from the team have any concluding comments?
I just wanted to say again, thank you all, and just building briefly on what Julia said and what we're hoping we've communicated here and what we've kind of, put into the book as we've written, worked together. Seeing this was a collaborative process for us that had so much value added to it, and even writing this book helped me see that even though sometimes it's a little messier and a little slower, the value of that group work and working together and what we could all bring, and having that asset orientation with each other and ourselves was so important. It is something we hope, we know we've communicated in the book, and we hope you can take and share with others and join us in the revolution, as Julia said.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for a very stimulating panel. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions and comments. It really lit up in the second half of the session. So there is contact information on your screen, and I encourage anyone who's interested in engaging the authors, further conversation, more questions, suggestions. If you have books that you are working on as attendees, Myers Education Press would be delighted to hear about them, especially on this topic, which is an important one. So thank you all for attending. Again, the book is Learning That Matters, a Field Guide to Course Design for Transformative Education, published by Myers Education Press. And we look forward to more of these webinars in the future. So Everyone, be safe, be well, take care.